3 seconds. That is how long it took General George S. Patton to cross the room when a Soviet colonel's hand connected with the face of an American Army medic in the summer of 1945 in occupied Germany. Not 3 minutes, 3 seconds. What he said when he arrived in front of that Soviet officer was not recorded in any official document. What he did next was, and the incident that followed it, the protest from the Soviet command, the cable from Eisenhower's headquarters, the meeting Patton was summoned to, tells you everything about what the alliance between Washington and Moscow was actually made of in the months after Germany surrendered. We're going to tell you everything about this today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows is hard to sit with. Now, if you're still here, let's start with what was actually in those files, and then we'll get into what it means. This was not supposed to reach the public. In the summer of 1945, the official position in Washington was that the United States and the Soviet Union were allies, that the war had been won together, and that the occupation of Germany would be managed cooperatively between the four powers that had defeated the Reich. That was the public version. The private version, the one being written in diaries and cables and internal memoranda by the men who were actually present in Germany and Austria during those months, was considerably more complicated. The American and Soviet occupation zones shared borders, and where they shared borders, American and Soviet soldiers encountered each other daily. Not in the controlled settings of formal diplomatic meetings, but in the actual texture of post-war Germany, in towns, at checkpoints, at supply depots, at the improvised hospitals and aid stations that were processing the enormous human wreckage the war had left behind. What happened in those encounters was not making it into the newspapers, and the people responsible for managing the alliance relationship between Washington and Moscow were working very hard to keep it that way. The reports coming into American intelligence from the Soviet occupation zones by the summer of 1945 described a pattern that the officers reading them found difficult to reconcile with the official characterization of the Soviets as partners. Civilian populations in Soviet-controlled territory were being subjected to systematic looting, rape, and forced deportation. Soviet troops were removing industrial equipment from German factories on an enormous scale and shipping it east. Former concentration camp prisoners who had been liberated by Soviet forces were being held in conditions that differed from what they had been liberated from in ways that required careful description to characterize accurately. American officers who encountered Soviet counterparts at formal liaison meetings were filing reports that described, in the restrained language of military correspondence, Soviet personnel who did not appear to share any of the American assumptions about how the occupation was supposed to work. George Patton was not helping. By the summer of 1945, Patton was serving as military governor of Bavaria, the American occupation zone that covered the southern portion of Germany. He had held the position since May, and by July he had developed a specific and increasingly unconcealed contempt for the Soviet presence in the neighboring occupation zones and for Soviet behavior toward the civilian populations under their control. His diary from those months is explicit. He wrote that the Soviets were not allies in any meaningful sense of the word. He wrote that the American army, as it then existed, could destroy the Soviet forces in Europe without serious difficulty. He wrote these things not once but repeatedly, in terms that left no ambiguity about what he thought. He also said them out loud, to his staff, to visiting journalists who were supposed to be covering the reconstruction of Bavaria and found themselves listening to the highest-ranking American general in the region tell them that the United States had won the wrong war. He was not discreet, and he did not believe discretion was something the situation called for. He had spent 3 years fighting for the right to say what he thought, and he was not going to stop now because the diplomats in Washington found it inconvenient. Patton had been developing his view of the Soviets for years before the occupation began. He had read everything available on the Red Army's conduct during the war. He had spoken with Polish officers whose country had been invaded by the Soviets in September 1939, while Poland was simultaneously being invaded by Germany from the west. He had encountered the aftermath of Soviet actions in the territories the Red Army had moved through, and he had attended the formal meetings with Soviet commanders that Allied protocol required, and had come away from each of them with a clearer conviction that the men across the table from him were not operating under any of the same assumptions about what the alliance was supposed to mean. He wrote in his diary after one such meeting in May 1945 that the Soviet generals he had encountered reminded him of nothing so much as primitive warlords dressed in the uniforms of a modern army, and that the diplomatic performance being asked of American officers in those meetings was one of the more undignified things he had been required to do in his military career. He did not communicate this view to the Soviet officers he met with. He communicated it with sufficient clarity to his own staff and to visiting American journalists that the substance of it was not a secret to anyone paying attention. The specific incident that concerns us here happened in late May 1945 at a former German military facility in Bavaria that was being used jointly by American and Soviet liaison personnel in connection with the repatriation of displaced persons. There were hundreds of thousands of people moving across Europe in those months: prisoners from concentration camps, forced laborers from across the Reich, soldiers who had been captured and were now being returned to their home countries, civilians who had been displaced by the fighting and were trying to get home. The logistics of managing that movement required American and Soviet personnel to work in the same physical spaces, processing the same columns of people, sometimes simultaneously. The medical staff at these facilities were primarily American because the American Army's medical corps was significantly better equipped than anything the Soviets had brought into Germany. American medics and doctors were treating people regardless of nationality, including Soviet citizens who were supposed to be handed over to Soviet control for repatriation, but who were in immediate medical need. The repatriation process had become one of the primary friction points between American and Soviet personnel in Bavaria. Under the agreements reached at Yalta in February 1945, Soviet citizens liberated by American forces were to be turned over to Soviet control for return to the USSR. This meant that the American facilities processing displaced persons were regularly visited by Soviet officers who came to identify and collect Soviet nationals. The visits were official and authorized. The conduct of the Soviet officers conducting them was, by the accounts of the American personnel who dealt with them regularly, something else. Reports filed through American military channels in Bavaria through the spring and summer of 1945 described Soviet liaison officers who arrived at American-run facilities and behaved as if the American military presence was an obstacle to be ignored, rather than a command authority to be acknowledged. Requests were issued as orders. Personnel were directed rather than asked. And in at least several documented cases, Soviet officers physically struck or shoved displaced persons, and, in some instances, American personnel who intervened. It was in this context, at a processing facility outside Munich, that a Soviet Army colonel encountered an American medic who was completing paperwork on a group of Soviet citizens the colonel had come to collect. The specific details of the exchange that preceded the strike are not in the surviving record. What is in the record is that the Soviet colonel struck the American soldier, a corporal assigned to a medical unit, an open-handed blow to the face. Patton was at the facility that day in his capacity as military governor of Bavaria, conducting what his schedule listed as a routine inspection. He was not scheduled to be in the section of the facility where the incident occurred. He went there because he heard it. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. What followed was witnessed by at least 6 American soldiers and 2 Soviet officers. Patton crossed the room to the Soviet colonel in the time it took most of the people present to register what had happened. He placed himself directly in front of the Soviet officer, at a distance that left no ambiguity about what was being communicated. He told the colonel, through his interpreter, that in his zone, soldiers of any nation who struck American military personnel would be treated as hostile combatants. He told the colonel that the man he had just struck outranked him in the only hierarchy that mattered in that room. He told the colonel to step back. The Soviet colonel did not step back immediately. Accounts of what happened in the following moment differ in their specifics. What the American witnesses agreed on was that Patton did not raise his voice and did not draw his weapon, which surprised some of them who had expected one or the other. What the Soviet officers reported back to their command, in a formal protest that reached Eisenhower's headquarters within 48 hours, was that Patton had physically threatened a senior Soviet officer and had created a diplomatic incident of serious proportions. Eisenhower received the Soviet protest at his headquarters in Frankfurt and read it with the specific expression his staff had come to associate with Patton problems. He sent a cable to Bavaria. The cable requested, in the language of military correspondence that had been refined over years of managing Patton's behavior, that Patton provide an account of the incident and an explanation of his actions. Patton's response was not what Eisenhower wanted. Patton confirmed that the incident had occurred substantially as the Soviets had described it. He confirmed that he had intervened when a Soviet officer struck an American soldier. He stated that this was the correct response and that he would do the same thing again under identical circumstances. He expressed no regret about the Soviet protest and suggested that the appropriate response to the protest was to note that Soviet officers who assaulted American personnel in the American occupation zone should expect to be dealt with accordingly. The cable exchange between Bavaria and Frankfurt over the following week was extensive, and Eisenhower's frustration with Patton is visible in every line of it. The problem was not that Eisenhower privately believed Patton had done something morally wrong. The problem was the timing and the politics. The four-power occupation of Germany depended on a functional working relationship between the American, Soviet, British, and French commands. That relationship was already under pressure from a dozen different directions. The question of German civilians being removed to Soviet territory, the treatment of American POWs liberated by Soviet forces, the Soviet behavior in the eastern occupation zones that American intelligence was beginning to document in detail. Adding a formal confrontation between Patton and the Soviet command to that list was the last thing Eisenhower needed. He told Patton to avoid further incidents with Soviet personnel. Patton acknowledged the instruction and continued doing exactly what he had been doing. The medic who had been struck, Corporal David Hendricks of the 45th Medical Battalion, gave a statement to his commanding officer describing the incident. In that statement, he noted that he had not expected anyone to intervene because the Soviet colonel had made it clear from the moment of his arrival that he considered American personnel present at the facility to be an inconvenience to be managed rather than colleagues to be worked with. Hendricks said that when he saw Patton cross the room, he assumed something else entirely was about to happen, and that the specific quality of Patton's intervention, the controlled anger, the direct physical presence, the refusal to raise his voice or reach for the weapon on his hip, was something he thought about for the rest of his life. The incident did not make the American press. It did not appear in any public statement from Eisenhower's headquarters or from the Soviet command. Both sides had reasons to keep it quiet. The Americans did not want another Patton incident complicating the occupation diplomacy. The Soviets did not want a public account of one of their colonels being confronted and effectively backed down by an American general in front of witnesses. What it did do was accelerate the timeline of Patton's removal from command. Eisenhower had been building a file of Patton incidents since the spring. The medic incident added to it. The press conference statements Patton made in September, comparing Nazi Party membership to American political party membership, provided the specific public incident that gave Eisenhower the political cover to act. On October 2nd, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army. The official version of why Patton was relieved of command centers on the September press conference, where he compared Nazi Party membership to American political party affiliation. That explanation is accurate as far as it goes. It does not go very far. By September, Eisenhower had accumulated months of incidents, of which the May confrontation with the Soviet colonel was one entry among many. The press conference provided a politically manageable reason to act on a decision that had already been reached, for reasons that were considerably harder to explain to the American public. What the May incident revealed, to anyone who was paying attention to what it meant rather than to its surface details, was that Patton's problem was not temperament in the abstract. His problem was that he was applying, in the specific situation of the American-Soviet occupation, the same standard he had applied in combat, which was that the appropriate response to someone striking a person under his command was immediate and unambiguous. That standard worked in a war. It was not the standard the occupation required, because the occupation required maintaining the fiction that the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in a cooperative enterprise, and Patton was constitutionally unable to maintain fictions he did not believe. He died 74 days later. The incident was not unique. What made it different from the other confrontations between American and Soviet personnel in the occupation zone was that Patton was present, and that his response was personal rather than administrative. The standard American response to incidents involving Soviet personnel in the occupation zones was to file a formal protest through the appropriate liaison channels, receive an acknowledgement that was not quite a denial and not quite an apology, and move on. Patton had filed his own response before anyone filed anything official, in person, in a room full of witnesses, and the Soviet command had been left in the position of protesting an action that their own colonel's behavior had provoked. The formal Soviet protest was diplomatically phrased. It characterized Patton's intervention as a violation of the protocols governing relations between Allied military commands in the occupation zone. It did not characterize what the Soviet colonel had done. That absence was noted by the American officers who read the protest, and who understood, without needing it explained, that the Soviets had calculated that a specific account of what their officer had done before Patton's intervention would weaken their position considerably. The Soviet colonel involved in the May incident was transferred out of Germany within a month of it occurring. Soviet military personnel records from the German occupation period remain classified in Moscow. The colonel's subsequent career, if he had one, is not accessible through any available archive. The men who were in that room in Bavaria in the summer of 1945 remember the specific silence that descended when Patton crossed the floor. They remember that the Soviet colonel was significantly taller than Patton, and that this appeared to matter to no one in the room, including the colonel. They remember that the American medic who had been struck did not move from where he was standing and did not look away. They remember that when it was over and the Soviet officers had left the facility, Patton stood for a moment, looking at the door they had exited through, and then said nothing and went back to his inspection. They remember that nobody who was present that day mentioned it in any official report, because everyone understood without being told that an accurate official report of what Patton had said and done would create problems that nobody in that room had any interest in creating. Most of them did not talk about it publicly until years later, and some of them not at all. By the time historians began documenting the specific texture of the American-Soviet relationship in the occupation period, the men who had been there were old and scattered, and the documents that would have confirmed what they described had either been classified, lost, or never written down in the first place. Now you know what was in the file. Did your father or grandfather serve in the occupation forces in Germany after 1945? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.